Hi folks, with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about, there's a lot of talk about an impending, on social media, about an impending possible alleged US civil war, and that the running battles between street mobs and, say, the ICE officers and this sort of thing is really the thin end of the wedge and the beginning of this slide into armed conflict, which is tantamount to a civil war. Some have argued. Now, similarly, there are a few others, such as Ramsey Paul and others that have suggested the Spanish Civil War in Europe from 1936 to 1939 offers, if you like, a modern sort of forum for the similarity between what a US Civil War would look like today and the Spanish Civil War back in 1936. So I don't see the parallels. I mean, there are some, it's an armed conflict, for goodness sakes, and that's what civil wars usually are. But in terms of the various issues to do with religion and so on, there are many parallels being drawn, and I think they're something of a stretch. And I think the point or the issues are really being missed when the assumption is there was a Spanish Civil War about Spanish issues. It wasn't. It was a much wider conflict than that, and drew in ideological issues from the Soviet Union and the international communist movement, international workers' socialist solidarity, and so on and so forth. So it's really, I think, the wider issues we need to look at. Just sort of a bit of background. The socialists. I think I'll go back even further. In the following the end of World War One, and Spain had been fairly neutral. It got, I guess, something of an artificial boom because whatever they had, particularly in terms of food and so on, they could sell, and so the economy became fairly reliant on selling, Spanish products, anything they could lay their hands on to the belligerents, and Spain was pretty corrupt. I mean, that sort of Latin corrupt sort of behavior, you just can't get away from it. And Spain was seen at the time as the sick man of Europe, corrupt and just lurching from sort of one crisis to another, whether it be economic or political or social. So it wasn't an economy that was doing well. And when World War One ended, and suddenly the demand for Spanish products began a fairly sharp decline, Spain went into a state of funk. Now, around this time, the Soviet communists, Russian communists who'd seized power in 1917, they were doing everything they could to export socialist revolution around the world, and they had a lot of agitators in Germany and Italy and so on. Now, the Soviet communist agitators in Italy came across Mussolini, who put paid to them, and so a lot of those agitators got kicked out of Italy in 1922 when Mussolini took control, and they were being hunted down pretty ruthlessly, the communist agitators, that is. And so a lot of them moved to Spain and began the agitation there. And then in 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, the Nazis clamped down quite heavily on socialist agitators and revolutionaries and troublemakers and stirrers, and a lot of them then went to Spain. So Spain had actually an unusually high proportion of international, agitators who were trying to overturn the government, turn into a socialist communist republic. Now, this was helped by the stagnant economy, the corruption, and the communists were internationally opposed to the church, and the Catholic Church was particularly prominent in Spain. They controlled a lot of the upmarket education, Jesuit education, which was considered to be very good, but rather strict, if not brutal, back in the day. And so, given the overrepresentation, if you like, of the church, the stagnant economy, high unemployment, they're classic ingredients for agitators to get in the middle of and say, hey, guess what? We can create a paradise world where everybody's equal and everyone's got waterfront mansions and so on. Oh, hey, I wouldn't mind a bit of that. But they couldn't really win it they couldn't win it at the ballot box. So they did a rigged election in I think it was 1934. So the socialists effectively rigged, well, didn't effectively, they did outright rig the election. The usual, like it was probably along the lines of the 2020 presidential election in the United States, where mysterious ballot boxes were arriving and disappearing, and mysterious midnight counts would change the vote, all that sort of stuff, where ballot forms, would appear magically, and and so they stole the election and rigged the election, and then started a fairly brutal crackdown on anybody who sort of wasn't really going along with the communist revolutionary type approach. So they then started killing off rivals and arbitrarily imprisoning them, and killing priests, killing off farmers that didn't like their land being collectivized and who'd previously owned the land. And so it was a very substantial killing spree. I mean, thousands were just arbitrarily executed in the street. And the police were controlled, of course, by the communist goons, wouldn't prosecute or arrest people for doing this because they were performing the work of the communist ideology, if you will. And so, and this is very much how Stalin, who had a big role in this international communist revolutionary movement. People don't agree with you and won't go along with you, kill them. Just take them out back and shoot them. And that was very much the Stalinist, and even Trotsky, for that matter, was into that. The view that the sanctity of the ideology, the purity of the ideology, the communist ideology required, indeed necessitated, the murdering of thousands, if not millions, of people to cleanse the society of those who may disagree. And the Spanish communists sort of went along with this, and they reached where they just overreached the various elements in society, and they were always a minority. These communists, they were never a majority. I mean, they were radical murdering activists, and so the majority were not happy with this and didn't go along with it. So this is when the army stepped in, and where General Franco began to take a prominent role. Now the communists fairly quickly came to assist the communist government that had rigged the election, that was not legitimate, and they came. So the Soviet Union started delivering aircraft and weapons and guns and ammunition. So they became fairly well. They were quite well provisioned from an equipment perspective. They weren't very good at organising and distributing the stuff they were getting, but Russian planes came over with Russian pilots, and they were bombing the General Franco. They were called revolutionaries, but they were nationalists. So the ideological divide between them was, you've got the radical communists murdering, election rigging communists on one side, and on the other side is the nationalists who believe that the church does have a place in society, the Catholic Church, and believes that the election was rigged and is thus invalid, thus the government is illegitimate, this sort of thing. And they believe that arbitrary arrest of people just because they don't share your point of view isn't really the done thing. They wanted more independence for the courts rather than the courts just rubber stamping of the Communist Party, goon squads. Now, was either side, particularly, could you say the one side, well, these guys really support democracy and the right thing? And well, no. one side was communist, and they decided to label the other side as fascist. This is general, but they weren't fascist. That's nonsense. They were nationalist and they were pro-religion, but fascist. I don't think so. Now Mussolini was laying claim to fascist as, less so the Nazis, but the Mussolini was laying claim. And he was an Italian political theorist that really sort of came up with the whole fascist notion. And but the fascist label was bullshit, I think. Or it just didn't stack up to scrutiny, maybe is a better way of putting it. Now, when the communists came in, they also activated the International Workers' Communist League, where they encouraged young people, particularly women, to come to Spain to serve the cause of fighting fascism. And even then, the term social justice was getting bandied around. So fighting for social justice. What was this social justice? The right to murder anyone who didn't agree with you? Is that the social justice they were talking about? Taking priests out the back and shooting them? Is that it? So this about 25, depending on whose numbers you look at, between 25 to 40,000 people came from the International Communist League to fight or to be, to work as medical staff. Here's something interesting, though, and you can see again the relationship between communism and Marxism and Jewish activism. Amongst the volunteer brigades that came from overseas, in fighting the Spanish, amongst the volunteer brigades, what was the second most? Spanish was the first. What was the second most common language amongst the international brigade? So it might have been English or French or something or whatever. No, it was Yiddish. It was a Jewish language. So the Jews were the second biggest component of activists fighting on behalf of the communists, including a decent spread of Jewish lesbians and this sort of thing. So it again, that's an interesting sort of fact that people tend to miss out. That a very large proportion of the people that came to fight for the communists were Jewish and Marxist. Anyway, once the communists, the Russians and the International sort of Communist Youth League got involved, then Hitler and Mussolini decided that they would throw their hand in with this, and they supported General Franco and the nationalists. Initially, it was just Mussolini, and the Italians even sent troops to Spain to help. And then Hitler got involved, or the Germans got involved, and what was known, I think, as the Condor Legion provided quite substantial logistical support in terms of transport aircraft and things like that, which were very helpful to the nationalists. In the end, they were just better organised. The troops on the nationalist side were just better trained, better led in the end, and they won. But the casualties are quite heavy. We're talking like 500,000 deaths, and it wasn't like Spain was a huge, it didn't have hundreds of millions of people or anything. So, and the disruption to business and farming and so on was huge. So, but the nationalists prevailed in the end. So, what are the parallels, if any, between a possible civil war in the United States, or maybe the West more generally, but looking at the United States at the moment, and the Spanish Civil War? I don't see the parallels. I see that the Spanish Civil War was part of the wider communists running around Europe, the agitator class running around Europe, looking for countries to destabilize and to turn into communist dictatorships. And again, if Mussolini hadn't kicked the communists out of Italy in 1922, and then Hitler out of Germany in 1933, I don't think they'd have had the Spain wasn't the top of the priority list, far from it. Spain was the main countries that the communists were looking for were industrialized countries, and Spain, on a relative basis, was one of the least industrialized in Western Europe. So it was well down the communist list, but it did have a very powerful religious sector, and it did have, particularly when the Great Depression came on, that just added sort of drama to the whole thing. They particularly had a large unemployed sort of peasant class, if you will, who were disaffected for obvious reasons, and thus were prone to the siren call of, hey, we've got a paradise and it's just around the corner. All we got to do is kill those folks over there in paradise, that sort of thing. When the communist agitators were very good at that, they had plenty of practice by then. And I think that was the bigger issue. Now, we could draw parallels and say, well, the globalists are acting as the international communists were to destabilize the Western democracies and so on. And there is a parallel there. I do get that. A lot of people say that it's the big firms like the BlackRocks and the Vanguards that are all Jewish controlled and administered. So there is a parallel. George Soros, the big NGOs that are working frantically to destabilize the Western democracies again. There's a large Jewish presence there. But I don't see that same parallel. If we, looking at the destabilization methods, mass migration of alien cultures into the West, and if you complain about it or question it or even notice it, they'll call you Hitler and say you're a Nazi, fascist, swastika waving Hitler. So that's a destabilizing thing. The Spanish didn't have mass importing of people, so that's not an issue there. The attacking of the church, that is an issue. That there's some parallel, but the influence that the church, the Catholic Church in particular, had over the Spanish society relative to the influence of the church generically in, say, the United States today, two very different things. The influence of the church in the United States today is nowhere near, not even close, remotely close to the penetration. Although there are attacks on the church all over the West, churches can be burned down and all that sort of thing. Government doesn't care. The globalist controlled governments don't care. If someone goes anywhere near a mosque, however, then it's prison for you, buddy. So the two-tier justice was very much a thing for the communist government in Spain. If you were committing heinous crimes, but in support of the communist cause, then you were fine. But if you committed a misdemeanor that may offend the communist cause, they put you in prison or kill you. And we see sort of similar to that today. The BLM rioters and Antifa rioters can burn down whole city blocks and they'll get a good behavior bond. But if somebody posts an edgy post on social media complaining about mass migration, they might go to prison, for goodness sakes. And that's the level of two-tier justice we're seeing in the West today. Places like Britain is a case in point. So there are similarities, but again, it's a stretch to draw the parallel. So it's the same or nearly the same or approximately. It's not. I don't see the similarities close enough. The two-tier justice, the attempting to roll back the education system to year zero, so that everything that went before was evil and fascist and Nazi and Hitler, but everything in the future from year zero is paradise, that sort of thing. But that was foisted on them. Effectively, they were ordered to do it by the communists. Remember the communist government in Spain is relying very heavily on the Soviet Union for equipment and logistics, air support, all that sort of. Without that, they're fucked. And so the communists were using that to say, well, we'll give you this support, but you've got to collectivize the farms. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. You've got to do so and so. And so they pretty much had, whether they would have gone along with that or done it in that same way, that's another matter. But they had a lot of ideological, and economic Soviet advisors that were in there telling them what to do, and it was conditional. We'll help you, but you got to do what we tell you to do. And I think the globalists are doing something similar to that. We'll let you run at huge budget deficits in these Western kingdoms, Britain and so on. We'll let you run these huge deficits, but you got to do what we tell you to do. Continue the mass migration, install black lesbians as CEOs of every company and this sort of thing. So you could argue some parallels there, but that's sort of how things would have been anyway. Any outside influence would have wanted their own ideas and views and ideologies imposed. Say we're paying for this and we want something in return for it. Anyway, the parallels, I think, between a possible U.S. Civil War and the Spanish Civil War, I think it's a real stretch for all the parallels. I see that the Spanish Civil War was an extension of the wider communist struggle, looking for revolutions and looking to overturn any capitalist government they could, and that they were using the Great Depression and they were using their surplus of agitators that had been kicked out of Italy and Germany and gone to Spain to stir up as much trouble as they could. And they were, due to the disaffected nature of a large peasantry in the rural areas, they figured that they had a decent stab at communist revolution. But they made the mistake if they tried to do it, A, by rigging elections, and B, at the point of a gun. And to some extent, I see that parallel there. If you look at 2020, they blatantly rigged election. And then the idea of chasing after people just because they don't agree with you, sending the FBI out after Trump, sending assassins out to get him, this sort of thing, that was, you could sort of say there's some loose parallels there, but I see the circumstances and conditions are different, sufficiently different, that the parallels, if any, are very few. You've been fantastic today. You're a Pushback Channel, and thank you for listening.